So here's what I'm hoping we're going to get through today, maybe bleeding into next class a little bit. One of the things that you were asked to do for today was to read Origin of Species Chapter 1, slog through Darwin's ancient prose, try to figure out what the hell he's talking about. The specific goals then for Chapter 1 are to appreciate what it means when we talk about individual differences. I suspect that you all already appreciate individual differences. Look around. Actually, which is pretty typical. I'm one of the only blondies in the class, so I'm representing individual differences right now. And then also to discuss what we're going to do today, how those individual differences, not among us, never mind, could be used for artificial selection. We're not here to learn about eugenics or anything like that, no master races. But in organisms that we have control over, we do use those individual differences for artificial selection to breed crops, animals, etc., that have traits that are useful to us, or whimsical, I suppose, given some of your submissions about artificial selection. And ultimately to come up with a group, hopefully, come up with a group consensus definition of what it means to be fit, and what it means to have descent with modification. So those are the key terms from Darwin's Chapter 1. Individual differences, descent with modification, and then we'll also talk about fitness and artificial selection a little bit. So what I did to start was I took all of your definitions at the start of last class, while you were waiting, which we didn't do today, was what do you define evolution as? And this is just a word cloud, taking all of those definitions that you wrote, most of you wrote, some of you wrote, and submitted. And this is kind of what our definition starts out looking like. So what are the big ideas? Definition of evolution. Change over time. Change. This is not a very fancy word cloud generator, so it doesn't distinguish the difference between change and changes. Obviously, change was the number one word that everybody generally used when they wrote a definition of evolution. But you'll also see time. What other words are important in here? So we've got time, change, survival, adaptation, environment. Oops, that's evolution. Wait, we're using evolution to define itself. Never mind. Circular argument. So generations, a measure of time. So that's the important measure of time for evolution. Evolution doesn't happen within a single individual in one generation. It happens over time in successive generations, so that's the type of time we're talking about in evolution, which means we have to think differently than we have in other biology classes where we're used to thinking about an individual. In developmental biology, we're used to thinking about a single cell individual developing, cells dividing, turning into adult individuals. So change over time. I'm going to read verbatim some of your submissions. I apologize for reading things verbatim, but I think this should stimulate a useful conversation. Oh, well, the first one maybe not. Evolution is change over time. We're already there. But it's important to note that, again, we're not talking about change over time being single-cell organism grows and changes over time. What's the type of time we're talking about? Generations. So generation to generation, there'll be change. So evolution, yes, has to do with change over time, but that's the time scale, generation to generation. So big time periods, not within an individual's life. How about this one? Evolution is change that benefits the survival of the organism. What do you think?
Change organism to species.
Can we change organism to species? Why would you do that? So, just a second. Evolution is change that benefits the survival of the species. Survival of the organism, survival of the species.
Species.
Okay, so I'm overwhelmingly hearing species from the front half of the room. Back half of the room? Evolution benefits the survival of the individual or the species?
The The species.
So why the species?
Because evolution doesn't affect one individual.
Because of
Because of the time needed for evolution to act.
Because of time, absolutely. So if we're talking about change over generations, then evolution never impacts, evolution doesn't occur within a single individual. So yeah, evolution has changed that benefits the survival of a species. Could work. And so what we're trying to do, and again, trying to engage you, I know it's early, don't fall asleep. We're trying to pick out some common themes and misunderstandings of evolution. First real day of class. So let's consciously address some of these. Evolution is the change of species from something simple to more complex. Yes, no. So why no?
Because complexity might not help the survival of the group.
So is complex always better?
No.
We could argue it. Let's see. My favorite worms, C. elegans, C. briggsii. They don't have eyes. But they do have proteins that detect ultraviolet light. And if the worm crawls into ultraviolet light, then it detects ultraviolet light, crawls out of ultraviolet light. Why would it want to be able to detect ultraviolet light? It's harmful. Ultraviolet light strong enough can break DNA, cause mutations, cause evolution. But that doesn't mean that it needs full-on vertebrate-style eyes to see light. It uses something very simple to do what it needs to do. So evolution doesn't have to move necessarily from simplicity to complexity. It can, it doesn't have to. Evolution is the process of changes or adaptations over time that allow for better survival. Where does that rank on the list of good to bad definitions? Process of changes or adaptations over time that allow for better survival. We've got time, we've got change. That's our core definition. What about better survival? Is that good? Of the species, let's say. Allow for better survival of the species. Okay, my friends, here we go really deep. Does it count as evolution if it's only useful here and now?
No.
What if it's change that eventually leads to your extinction? So it's still change over time, it's just not beneficial change over time. Does that still count as evolution?
Yes.
Okay, so sounds like from smattering of people, concept is that any change, good or bad, but how do we rectify or how do we qualify that, how do we clarify the idea of evolution enhancing the survival of the species versus the idea that any change is evolution? Fitness.
Isn't that like allowing a species to become dominant over another species during that time? Because it's able to like produce offspring for the next generation,
So fitness is all about producing offspring. The meaning of life, if you ask an evolutionary biologist or a philosopher maybe, to reproduce. You didn't know that evolutionary biologists and philosophers had anything in common, but the meaning of life is to pass your genes on, according to an evolutionary biologist, to pass your genes on to the next generation, to reproduce. So we're going to be talking a lot about fitness and ways to measure fitness. That is, how evolutionarily successful are you and your genotype, your genes, in the current situation. So one of the things we're going to have to do is rectify this apparent conflict between the idea that evolution is change that improves your fitness and the idea that any change might be evolution. The way I suggest doing this to start the term anyway is simply to think of evolution as change that's beneficial here and now, in the current environment, in your current situation. So can anybody think of a situation where, theoretical or real, where an organism could be fit in its current environment, but if you moved it somewhere else, if you changed the environment, that it would no longer be as fit, as able to reproduce?
It's like taking a polar bear and like putting it in a desert.
Fabulous. That's great. Let's not do it, but let's take a polar bear and drop it in the Sahara. Right? Wonderful theoretical example of how that polar bear might be really super fit in the Arctic, but if you change its environment, global warming, then it might not be as fit anymore. So evolution tends to drive populations towards fitness maxima. You can think of fitness as being a mountain, and organisms tend to evolve towards being optimally fit in their environment. But organisms can't see into the future. Natural selection can't see into the future and detect, oh, there's change coming, and start responding to it before the change actually arrives. So there's not really any perfectly adapted species or individuals, let's say, as long as the environment's in a state of change. You know, it's chasing a moving target with evolution. So let's change a little bit. So that's sort of a definition of evolution. It's a working definition. We can change it over time. Okay. If you took anything out of Darwin's chapter 1, it's an understanding of pigeons. Okay. Why did Darwin use pigeons? Did any of you know anything about pigeons before you read Darwin chapter 1? Do you now? Maybe not. Why do you think Darwin talked about pigeons in the first chapter of his book? The opening, right, where you're supposed to try to grab people's attention, which I don't necessarily do so well at 8 in the morning, but Darwin did. He talked about pigeons. Why pigeons?
Maybe most people back then understood pigeons.
Well, yeah, most people back then, I don't know if they understood pigeons, but they were, yeah.
It was commonplace.
It was common. There were pigeon fanciers, so it was a thing. Like we have mouse and rat fanciers today, right? People that have these weird mutant rats and mice, and they go to shows and they show off their mice, and they trade them with other people, and they make new weird combinations of mice with curly hair and whatever, big ears. I was looking at one of your websites. One of you posted mouse, I think, fancying as one of your examples of artificial selection. So yeah, back in the day, it was all about pigeons. So that's why Darwin started The Origin of Species with pigeons. He was trying to grab people's attention with something they knew. He was trying to show them, what's the big point? Why does talking about artificial selection help us learn anything about evolution?
Is it because it's like a form of evolution that we've been able to observe?
Did everybody hear that? Right? It's presumably, although we can certainly debate this in class, a form of evolution that we as a species, humans, have been able to observe. We did it over short periods of time. And most of the population of Great Britain was familiar with that concept. Yeah, we took pigeons that happen to have these huge feathers on their feet. Those are weird looking, kind of like chicken fanciers too, same thing. Chickens with weird plumage. You'd have mutants, pigeons that grew huge feathers on their feet and ones that had crests on their heads. You could mate them together and try to combine those two traits. Not because it's particularly useful, it's just cool looking. So that's taking individual differences, variation that exists in nature, and artificially selecting it. So in this case, why do we call it artificial selection and not natural selection?
Is it because we actually have a role in it? Is it we actually do it and not nature takes its cake?
So we have a role in it, it's not natural, well it is, how is it natural? How is artificial selection natural?
They're still breeding.
Okay, they're still mating with each other, and we're still starting with naturally existing individual differences. Right? Back in the day, 1800s, people weren't throwing mutagens, chemicals on the pigeons and trying to make them, trying to induce mutations, trying to make mutant pigeons. They were just popping up randomly, as mutations do, every once in a while, and when a useful one, useful to us, mutation occurred, then you try to breed that mutation into future generations. But it's artificial because we play a role in it. So the pressure to keep that mutation around in existence is not nature, it's us. We're putting artificial pressure or artificial means of keeping those mutations in existence. How do you lose mutations? You get a pigeon that has feathers on its feet. What do you have to do to keep it around?
Made it with another pigeon.
Make it breed, yeah. Make it have babies, or hope that it has babies. I don't know if you can really force pigeons to reproduce, but you can try. So this is how those naturally occurring mutations can be lost if you don't reproduce, if you're unfit. So normally that's natural selection out in the wild. Mutation arises, and if that individual doesn't happen to reproduce, that mutation is lost until it happens to occur again. So I just want to highlight a couple of examples of photos that you submitted, just a couple, literally. I can't, unfortunately, have all of your pictures up here, although that would be kind of cool. Make it into a portrait of Darwin with all of your pictures. So we've got wild turkeys, domesticated turkeys. You get turkeys that have larger breasts, and so you breed them for larger breasts, and pretty soon you have these ginormous, oversized, domesticated turkeys that are good for eating. But if you put them out in the wild, I don't know what would happen. Cheetah fodder, I don't know, if you put them in Africa. So this is artificial selection. This is us choosing traits and only letting those animals with the desired traits breed and have offspring. I'm glad this was the version of wild turkey that you posted, not the type of wild turkey. Here's a perfect example, a new one to me, which is why I like it. Gossypium hirsutum. Hirsute, hairy. Cotton. So cotton used to be on the top row there, wild versions of cotton. Make little tiny puffs with short fibers, but you can select over time by choosing random mutants in the wild that have slightly longer or slightly wider or whatever fibers. You artificially breed this cotton that's useful for making jeans, I guess. So domestication and artificial selection. Great example. This one's mine. Mostly because I love dogs. I'm not a dog person, but this perfectly illustrates taking natural variation in a species, Canis familiaris, the dog, and breeding them to have all sorts of different traits. Imagine how much variation, picture in your mind any breed of dog. Okay, now tell me which breed of dog you're thinking of. Pit bull. Great Dane. Okay, imagine a pit bull and a Great Dane trying to reproduce. Close your eyes and think about it enough. Right. Imagine the types of natural, no one was throwing chemicals on the dogs to try to make them pit bulls and Great Danes. Naturally existing mutations bred by humans over hundreds of thousands of years created those huge differences in temperament, in size, and those are all based on naturally existing mutations that cause slight differences every generation in the breeds. So we've got this huge array of breeds of dogs, temper, right, and morphology. All started with naturally occurring mutations. So once again, let's come back to this idea about, does this fit our definition of evolution? Why or why not? So any form of domestication, cotton, dogs, wild turkeys, domestic turkeys.
Yes.
Okay, so we've got a yes, one yes. They represent evolution. So it's, what are the key highlights of evolution that these sorts of examples all fit? Think back to the word clock. So it's change. Hope everybody agrees. Over time. So it took a little bit of time, hundreds of years, tens of years, generations and generations of dog breeding, turkey breeding, cotton breeding.
So certain species adapt to different environments, so that would be also the form of evolution, like certain plants, like salt-loving plants only want to live in certain areas. Actually, like that has a wider range of areas, but that adaptation allows them to be able to evolve as well.
So think about the dog example again. Are the traits that the dog breeds have beneficial? Do they enhance their ability to survive or reproduce?
Yes.
No. I think humans well, it kind of depends, because some humans select form depending on what they want them for.
That's the artificial part.
Yeah.
I was thinking in terms of cats, because I'm like.
Yeah, please. Yeah, cats are fine too. We can talk about cats.
Cats,
Yeah.
you know, like their bodies keep growing, but their feet stay kind of short, or their legs, and so it's adorable, but it's not very good for the cat because
Right.
Right.
Or we can talk about golden retrievers and the issues that some golden retrievers have, because the traits that were bred into golden retrievers also predispose them to some unfortunate later in life phenotypes. So this is where the artificial part comes in. These traits are useful to these organisms, dogs and cats, cotton, when we are controlling who reproduces. That's the artificial part of artificial selection. If we're breeding Dalmatians and one of them doesn't have black spots, then we don't let that Dalmatian reproduce. Maybe. I'm not mean, I'm just saying. If I was a Dalmatian breeder, I would lock that Dalmatian up and not let it breed. I probably should turn off the microphone. So that's the artificial part of artificial selection. And we can definitely talk about whether or not these processes of artificial selection meet our requirements for evolution. But it is change over time. And in the situation of artificial selection, those changes, if they are pleasing to us, do help those organisms have higher fitness, because then we allow them to reproduce. In the wild, presumably the same thing is happening. Any questions? Clarifications we need to make?
I have one.
Please.
So when it comes to artificial selection, if you're selecting for traits that you find, I don't know, good for the species, who's to say that that's overall what's beneficial to that particular species? Maybe you're not the species and it has to adapt to certain environments.
Right. So if you have artificial selection going on, you've got two different dog breeders, and they disagree on what's a beneficial trait. What happens? You get two different breeds of dogs. They look different. What happens to those breeds over time? They stay different, generation to generation. What happens eventually? They become different species. Hey, look, we're talking about the origin of species. Right? The whole book is all about Darwin trying to figure out how we get species to form. So think German Shepherd and Coyote. They look pretty similar. One's domesticated, one's not. But they look pretty similar, but they don't mate with each other. They do occasionally. They make Kai dogs. That's not my term. Somebody else coined that term. Coyote, half dog, a Kai dog. But they're different species now. their offspring are sterile. So given enough time, any two populations, even if they are originally of the same species, can turn into different species. And that might be what happens when you have different people working with the same organism over long periods of time, evolving them in different ways.
I have a question.
That's how you get Chihuahuas and Great Danes.
For the examples of domestication, if they represent evolution, so you said that a lot of these traits that we pick out are artificial because we're picking them out. But didn't we also talk about how sometimes during that time natural mutations occur? So things are going to change anyway, and then we might change our mind as to what we want to pick out. So I mean, it's kind of hard to define whether or not these are actually, if it's evolution or not, because some of it could be, you know what I mean?
So there is, yes, while we are artificially selecting, there's also some natural selection going on at the same time potentially. We don't have to worry about the complexities of that yet, at least, but it's definitely true. So while you're in the process of making golden retrievers that have that lovely coat color, you might get another mutation that makes them have ears that stick up instead of droop. So evolution you can't stop, unless you can find a way to stop mutations from happening. If you had superpowers, would you stop mutations from happening? Would anybody like to stop all mutation from happening?
If you had some,
Uh-oh.
could you use your powers to stop?
If you could use your powers to stop, you have a choice. You either let things go as they happen right now, random mutations happen to everybody all the time, or you stop all mutations forever.
Well, it depends on the battle.
We reach extinction.
I mean, a disease
Within our species. So
disease would stop, like cancer and stuff.
let's see, so cancer would stop? So cancers are caused often by mutations.
Are you speaking genetic or environmental? There's a difference.
All mutations. So from here on out, no human, to clarify this really weird theoretical, all humans would no longer encounter any mutations in their DNA.
A lot of disease.
Good or bad?
Bad.
Okay. Good. I mean,
Bad.
bad is what I was going for, thank you very much. Okay.
Well, assuming nothing new arises or nothing new isn't introduced into the environment,
Right.
ideally we'd be okay in our current state. Now, if there's some kind of organism in the ground that we've never seen before that comes up because we're digging for more oil, then we're going to be, or whatever.
Yep, sure.
All of a sudden, we're going to introduce this new organism that we've never seen before, and we're going to possibly get wiped out.
Okay.
The thing is that with seizing our mutation, we also have to seize the environment. We have to keep it still and we have to keep it the way it is. And
Right.
the environment isn't going to do that.
Sure. So if we agree that we're relatively a fit species right now given our environment, we don't have to agree. It's just hypothetical. If we're relatively fit right now, we might stay that way as long as the environment doesn't change. Then maybe it's okay if we don't have mutation. But mutations do good things for us, sometimes. Sometimes bad, sometimes good. That's why we're here. One of the huge misconceptions, which I'm sure a lot of you don't actually share, but out there, beyond the walls of the ivory tower, right, mutations are bad. Case in point, although I know you're much more advanced than my genetics students, you were once sitting in their seats at 11 o'clock right here in the same room. The thing that I asked them to do the first day of class was not to define evolution, but to do a free association. Close your eyes. What's the first thing you think about when I say the word mutant? X-Men, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Monsters. Right? So there's this misconception or alternative conception that mutations are bad. We all know that's not necessarily the case. Some mutations are beneficial. That's something we're going to talk about a lot this semester, right, to try to reinforce that concept. And so when you go to the bar or you're talking to your family around the dinner table and this comes up, you can say, well, here's a great example of how not all mutations are bad. This is especially important now that we're getting into the era of genetically modified organisms. So I'm going to try to prepare you to have that conversation. I'm not going to try to prepare you in one direction or the other. I'm going to try to provide evidence so that you can make decisions about whether or not genetically modified organisms are useful, harmful, dangerous, or not. So here's an example of individual differences. This is before artificial or natural selection. And my father is also a biologist. He's been teaching biology since '68. You do the math. He's retired, but he's still teaching biology. And he's also a photographer and loves to hike. So he's in Oregon. Every time he sees a dwarf dogwood plant when he's hiking, he takes a picture. Well, not every time. When he sees a new version, a new variety of dwarf dogwood, he takes a picture. This is a sampling of some of the individual variation he's seen over the last 4 or 5 or 6 decades. Does anybody know what a normal, none of these are normal, by the way. I should have put up what they typically look like. Does anybody know what a dwarf dogwood normally looks like? The flower looks kind of like the one in the bottom center here. So dwarf dogwoods, well, they're dwarf. They grow about that high off the ground. They have flowers that are about that size. So this one in the middle here is almost a normal looking dwarf dogwood. This one right here. It's got slightly larger petals than you might expect on a dwarf dogwood. But look at all the variation. We've got plants that have one petal that's bigger than the others. Poor mutant. Not symmetrical anymore. We've got one that's 2 petals, 2 tiny petals, triangle shaped. It's got 6 petals, big ones, small ones. Like all this variation. The weird ones, leaves growing out of the petals. So this is the natural substrate that natural selection now gets to act on. Are any of these more fit or less fit than your average dwarf dogwood, the one in the middle and the bottom? So if you imagine you were a dwarf dogwood breeder, you'd have all sorts of, you could become a pigeon fancier of dwarf dogwoods. Make all sorts of weird, wacky looking dwarf dogwoods. This happens to us too. I just wanted to provide you some facts. Don't memorize the facts. I hope they're interesting, but you don't have to memorize. Of course, I already asked you to look around and to recognize the great amount of variation we have in the room. But I just wanted to give you a perspective on mutations in humans. So if you look at one specific part, one specific nucleotide on one of your chromosomes, there's a pretty small chance that you win the lottery, or that a mutation happens at that particular nucleotide you're looking at, if you reproduce. 1 in 200 million chance. So the mutation rate in humans is per nucleotide is pretty low. You'd have to have a lot of kids, before you happen to have one that had one mutation in that gene at that particular spot you're looking at. So overall, given that there are 3 billion letters, nucleotides in our genomes, every time a gamete is created, a sperm or an oocyte, there are about 15 mutations in it. That is 15 genetic differences between the parent that produced it and the gamete. So your kids, my kids, are mutants compared to me. They're a little bit different. This is the genetic basis of that individual variation. The dwarf dogwoods, humans, and so forth. So the fact that there are so many humans on the planet means that on this planet right now, every possible point mutation, single nucleotide change, at every spot on every chromosome exists somewhere. It also means that we're all very, very similar to each other genetically. Really similar to each other. So how do we get to be so different? 1 in 1,000 nucleotides, every 1,000 nucleotides, one's different, on average, between you and me.
Gene expression?
So there are lots of, so it's not just your DNA sequences, it's whether or not your genes are turned on, when they're turned on, what cells they're turned on in. Thank you, genetics. So those rare differences between us are what account for our huge differences. And of course, this impacts 2 key aspects of evolution. The concepts of survival of the fittest. So we have all this variation. That means that some of us are going to be more fit than others. Some of us will have the bad mutations. Some of us have the good mutations. Congratulations to those of you with the good mutations. But then, even if we are the lucky ones, our kids are going to be slightly different. So the game gets played again. Which of them is more or less fit? And on and on and on. So let's get this quickly out of the way. Is this what we're talking about when we talk about the survival of the fittest? When might it be? Let's be honest, we're all humans, out on the dating scene. Who gets the date? Right, so there's a component of attractiveness, there's a component of physique. Now, of course, that's not the way it always happens. So what are we talking about? We already mentioned this quickly. So fitness, when we talk about evolution, we're not talking about physical fitness, we're talking about reproduction. So if you reproduce, you're declared to be fit. You reproduce more, you're fitter, more fit. If you reproduce less, you're less fit, if you have fewer offspring. So in evolution, the game is make a lot of kids. Because that passes your genome on to the next generation. Your genes survive longer. That's how evolutionary biologists define fitness. Any questions about fitness? So we'll talk in great detail, this is just an introduction, later in the semester about how evolutionary biologists really quantify and measure fitness. It's hard. That's why we use model organisms, because nobody wants to, we can track humans, I suppose, nobody wants to follow wild mice around and try to figure out how many offspring they have. It's kind of hard. We live in burrows. So we'll talk a lot about model organisms because we can easily measure their fitness. And I just threw in a couple examples of descent with modification, or how differences propagate from parents to their offspring. So you have two parents that have a lot of genetic variation. They have kids that exhibit that degree of genetic variation. So it's pretty easy to see how natural selection, if this was not a human species, if this is a different species, you can see how natural selection might act on the next generation. To make it more personal, for me, so this is my family. So I wanted to show you, although I know you understand this, but it's all about me. So these are my parents, mom and dad, right there. Now let's do descent with modification. I know it's tiny. Let's do descent with modification though. It's really hard to see. Which of my parents I look more like? Let's see. I got my nose from my dad. I got my ears from my dad. I got my teeth from my mom. I look a lot more like one of my sisters than the other of my sisters. Right? Facial features very similar with my blonde sister than my dark-haired sister.
Are you closer in age to the sister on the left?
Yes, I am. So she's 9 years older. She's 12 years older. Don't ask if I was a mistake. I never did. Didn't want to know. Doesn't matter now. My parents are more fit because of me. But I get my hairline from my dad. My dad, right, that's him at different ages, got his hairline from his father, right? So that trait seems to be passing from father to son, father to son. And then one of my daughters, I've got two daughters, one of them looks more like me. That's really hard to tell, just take my word for it. Then my other daughter, who gets dimples from her mother's side of the family, right? So this is descent with modification, right? Combinations of traits from both parents into the kids. The kids look unique. You rarely have offspring that are identical. So there's always substrate for natural selection to act on. There's always little, even though we can't see them sometimes, there are always little differences between individuals, even if they're members, even if they're siblings, the same parents. You understand this, you've taken genetics. There will be genetic differences. And so this is the concept of descent with modification. Over many generations, you get lots of change between individuals of the same species. Eventually, those species, those groups of individuals that are very distinct, no longer recognize each other as the same species. They no longer mate with each other, or they're no longer able to mate with each other. They become different species. So that's the big goal of the class this term, is to figure out how the origin of species works, and it all starts with individual differences. So we'll talk about details of speciation in the chapter on speciation about halfway through the term. Any questions? So again, today's just big picture. We've talked about a definition of evolution. We've talked about the concept of individual differences, artificial selection versus natural selection. We've talked a little bit about fitness. We'll talk about how to measure fitness later. So your typical first day of class for the content, talking about definitions, we're laying groundwork. And now we turn to a couple potentially less interesting topics, and then we're done. So quickly. Question 1. The bookstore, having run out of textbooks, would like to know how many more textbooks to purchase. Cyrena, Stephen, and Henry, I already got your emails, so 3 of you. Does anybody else, other than those 3 people, want to buy a textbook, Bergstrom and Dugatkin, the big one, from the library, or from the bookstore? If so, please raise your hand. I just need to get a count. So you got yours, so 1, 2, okay, so 2 more. Thank you. And the last thing is I'd like you to take a 4-credit, but only for small numbers of points, exit activity using Socrative. So this is for completion. This will help us get going with next chapter.
And when is that officially need to be done?
This needs to be done if my internet connection works. Hang on. Sometime in the next few hours. All right, give me a second or two. Quick little internet hiccup, then I can launch the quiz. So if you want to leave now, you can. You don't have to do the quiz now, but sometime by 11 o'clock, let's say. It's a few questions, but they're writing questions. So it'll probably take you 5 minutes or so, which is why I was hoping to start it now. Just a second. Has everybody else been having internet issues? Oh, it's just me? Go figure. Artificial selection against me. Okay, we're live. So yeah, if you please take that in the next hour, 2 hours, let's say 2 hours, by just before 11 o'clock. And with that, it's good to see you all again. Thanks for showing up early on a Monday, and I'll see you on Wednesday when you're done. You can leave. And if you have any technical issues, again, please raise your hand. We've got our guide on the go in the back, and I'm wandering around as well to help with technical issues. Okay, thank you. Let's see. Short answers is perfectly fine. I'm not looking for paragraphs and paragraphs, just concepts and ideas.